Yeah, that's truly amazing.
They should call the students to come, otherwise they will stay.
They'll stay forever. Is indefinite.
Você não soldou a organização? Tem que chamar o pessoal, você viu? Hã? Tem que chamar o pessoal. Ah, falou. You're going to stay a little bit more in
Yeah. I'm not going to come to the conference because I think the conference is in Portuguese, isn't it? So that won't mean much to me. But I'm going to stay in Belo Horizonte for another 3 days.
3 days. But you come to attend to see
No.
So if you
Look around.
going to talk to you, you have to find you at the hotel.
Yeah, yeah.
Vai ter algumas plenárias de inglês? Plenárias não tem inglês? Plenárias? Não sei.
Só uns pouquinhos, né?
I'll start. Will I start?
It's up to you. Do you want to start? The problem is that they understand,
Yeah, that's right.
what's on the coffee break.
Yeah, looks as though you're starting to drift back, so I'll make a start. Yeah, you can say we're going to start.
Por favor, gente, vamos começar. É só relembrar o seguinte, já que nós adiantamos o coffee break, não seria essa hora, né? Nós vamos ficar aqui até 18h40, então ele vai ser direto, tá ok?
I somewhat apologise for the technical nature of the previous talk, but tools in systems science, tools are everything, and I wanted to tell you some new tools. But I know it's a mixed audience, and so what I'm going to do now is something that is understandable virtually by everybody, and I'm doing this as more to entertainment, but really to show you the power of system science in solving real-world problems. Okay, so I'm going to talk about diabetes. And let me just tell you a little bit about diabetes to start with. These facts will be known to many people in the audience, but perhaps not to all. More than 8% of the people in the world suffer from diabetes. So if you take 100 people, on average, 8 of them will have one form or another of diabetes. About 10% of those people will have type 1 diabetes. Now, type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease. And what happens is that your own body attacks the pancreas and you can no longer produce beta cells, which means you can no longer regulate your blood sugar levels. The numbers are increasing. You all know that the number of type 2 diabetes sufferers is increasing rapidly, and this is the so-called lifestyle disease. Not always, but it's often associated with overeating, because by overeating you kind of wear the system out and it becomes less sensitive to the body producing insulin. But surprisingly, the number of type 1 diabetes sufferers is also going up. And you might conjecture why that is, but maybe as we change our lifestyle, there are genetic changes taking place in the population as a whole, which mean that more people are getting susceptible to type 1 diabetes. Now, treatment is costly and invasive to patients. I can't guess how many people back here now. Don't put your hand up, but I would be quite not at all surprised to find that there's 1 or maybe 2 type 1 diabetes sufferers in the audience. Right? I just gave a talk at Purdue with about this size audience, and 2 people came up afterwards and said, yes, we've both got type 1 diabetes. Right, current outcomes, if treated properly, you can have very good outcomes, but for children, it's very difficult because they frequently don't do what they're told to do. So this is an issue. Many people die from diabetes complications. My mother died of diabetes complications, so I'm interested in this story. But she was treated a long time ago. But in 2004, it's estimated that 3.5 million people died from diabetes complications in the world. And it's the 6th highest cause of mortality in Australia at the moment. So diabetes is a major problem. This chart shows you where diabetes is prevalent in the world, and the dark areas show where it's most prevalent. North America, predominantly type 2 diabetes. Here in South America, still a lot of people suffering from diabetes. In China, for example, you can see the rapid growth. In 2000, there were 20 million people with diabetes. By 2030, that will grow to 42 million people suffering from diabetes. So it's a major health problem. So I say this has got nothing to do with sparse models. Maybe a little bit, but not much. But it's a really interesting application, and it's meant for those people who are not necessarily committed to control or systems, but to see some real-world application where control and systems thinking and modelling can have a huge impact. So it's meant to be of general interest. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is the goal of the research program. Now, lots of research programs are dedicated to this area. I was just talking to a friend down the front who said that 85% of the work in biosensing in the world is dedicated to blood glucose measurement, right? 85%. So it sort of lets you calibrate how important this problem is. This is not controlling an aircraft or controlling a car or minimising energy consumption or controlling a robot. This is a huge problem. A multi-$100 billion industry in the world is dedicated to treating diabetes. So I'm going to talk about what the goal of the research is, our research. I'm going to talk about the models that we're interested in. I'm going to talk a little bit about fundamental limitations and why I'm interested in that topic. That's part 3. I'm going to talk about control system design, show you some preliminary results, and draw conclusions. Now this time I really do hope people at least will ask questions afterwards. Right. So the goal is to develop a feedback system that facilitates the regulation of blood glucose. In a healthy human being, our blood glucose goes up and down, but in a person suffering from type 1 diabetes, there is no regulation mechanism. And so this in developing countries like Papua New Guinea, where detection of diabetes is less well known in the community, this is called the sort of fading disease, because people who get it seem to just fade away. and very quickly die. What are the complications of having too much blood sugar? By having too high a blood sugar, you get cardiovascular disease, you go blind, eventually you lose limbs, and over the long term you have very, very bad outcomes. So why don't we just lower blood glucose level down? Right? And we don't have all those nasty problems. Well, the difficulty is that if you have too low a blood sugar level, the first thing is you go into coma, and the second thing is you die. Not good. So I'm hoping when I go back to seeking funding from a number of sources, but one is from the Danny Meads Barlow Foundation. Now, Danny Meads Barlow was a young Australian girl. She was 17 years old, beautiful young lady, active, loved sport, looked exactly like any of the beautiful young ladies in the audience. And she went to bed at 10:30 at night and did not wake up in the morning. And so her parents are funding diabetes research. And her case is, I'll tell you what my conjecture is of what caused the problem later. So what we want to do is to have zero hypoglycemic events. Hypoglycemic means too low a blood sugar level, because that's the one you die from straight away. And hyperglycemia is we're trying to minimise the time you spend with high blood sugar level. Okay, so is everybody interested in this problem? I bet everybody here knows somebody who has diabetes. You must do. Think. Do you know a relative, a friend? Everybody has one. My niece has type 1 diabetes. Right? So you don't have to go very far to find somebody with type 1 diabetes. And as I said, I wouldn't be surprised if there's at least one person here with it. Okay, so we want zero low excursions of blood sugar, and we want to minimise the time you spend in the upper regions of blood sugar. Yeah.
Would be for both type 1 and type 2?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. The question was, are we targeting type 1 only, or is there relevance to type 2? Initially type 1, because type 1 is you either have it or you don't. And so, in some sense, the symptoms are black and white. And so it's not easier to deal with, it's just that you know what you're facing. Type 2 is much more varied, and many people with type 2 can actually treat it by just changing lifestyle, do more exercise, eat a little bit less, eat less carbohydrate, and they can live healthy lives. So it's a lot more difficult. Our long-term objective is to treat type 2 as well as type 1. But the best, probably in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases, the best treatment for type 2 diabetes is lifestyle changes. Okay, so there's lots of instrumentation becoming available. As I said a moment ago, I've just learnt that 85% of the biosensors in the world are aimed at measuring blood glucose level. That is amazing. I didn't know that before. It's truly amazing. There are other measurements that you can make. How many people in the audience wear a exercise band? Is this popular in Brazil? Exercise bands. Somebody have one? Somebody got an exercise band? Yeah, we've got a couple. Yeah, yep. In the United States and Australia, exercise bands are the latest the thing you've got to wear, right? And what does an exercise band do? It measures how much exercise you're doing in various ways. And that's a big component in your determinant of your blood glucose level, as I'll explain in a moment. Right? They're also developing watches or rings now which give you measurement of heart rate, direct measurement of heart rate. And that's a wonderful measure. The usual wristwatches measure accelerations, but soon we'll have ones that measure your heart rate. And a personal observation, I don't know if anybody else has ever worn a heart rate monitor. Who's ever put on a heart rate monitor? Yep. Heart rate monitor? Yeah. These things work very well because they're attached around here where you can measure directly the beating of the heart. And I found that it's a very good measure of my exercise level. I just have to walk up a small slope and I can see that my heart rate goes from 60 beats per minute to 90 beats per minute. I don't know I'm doing exercise. Do you notice that? That just a very mild exercise and your heart rate seems to go up because you need to oxygenate the blood more. And then if I start to do a little bit more active work, my heart rate goes up to about 120, which is twice my resting rate. And I'm not stressed at all, but I now know I'm doing moderate exercise. And then if I start really pumping exercise, jog a bit or ride a bicycle, I find I can get my heart rate up to about 180, and then I know I'm really working. So heart rate monitors, and if you can wear a ring that measures heart rate, that would be an indicator of exercise level. So there's a whole lot of instrumentation. I'm also interested in measuring adrenaline levels, for a reason I'll say in a minute. And multiple measurements of blood glucose level. The one that's currently available is quite noisy and drifts, so there's a lot of work going on developing new techniques for measuring how much sugar you've got in your blood. This is a friend of mine, a young boy, who's a type 1 diabetes sufferer, and he's wearing some of the instrumentation that's currently available. This is a continuous blood glucose sensor, which is sending by Bluetooth signals to this, saying what the current estimate of blood sugar is. And this is a pump, which pumps insulin under the skin to regulate blood sugar level. And in principle, you'd think you could connect this directly to this and have a closed loop system. That's the sort of dream. I don't think that's sensible at the present time, as I'll explain later. Right, so now we get on to models. How do we understand this problem? And there's a message in this. I don't care whether you're an undergraduate or you're a postgraduate or a staff member, professor. The approach that we systems engineers take to these difficult problems is always the same. Right? Always the same. And it's a proven strategy. What's the proven strategy? The proven strategy is, first of all, you come to understand the system. So if you're going to study blood glucose, you need to read a book on biology and insulin and blood glucose regulation. And you see the organs involved, mainly the pancreas. That's the one that fails in type 1 diabetes, but also the intestines, the stomach, the liver's involved, so there's lots of elements to the story. And then what do we do? How does a system engineer approach a control problem? Well, what they do is they think of this as a set of models. They try to understand each little bit of the puzzle. So this is sort of physical modelling, but here it's biological modelling. Okay, so here's some of the things of importance. First of all, when we have a meal, it goes into our intestines, and some operations go on it, and we produce blood sugar. When we do exercise, what it does is it takes glucose from our muscles, which needs to be replaced. So you can think of this as a negative impact on blood sugar levels. Then the normal pancreas produces insulin and some other substances, but we'll just talk about insulin, which then allow other mechanisms to reduce blood sugar level. So that's why insulin analogues are used to reduce blood sugar level. If your pancreas is not working, then you need to inject insulin. There's other cells involved. The brain is a major user of sugar, right? That doesn't mean you can eat lots of sweets, but the brain runs on sugar. And so that's why if you have very low blood sugar level, you go into coma, because your brain stops functioning. All right. So, but the brain is a major user of sugar. So all of these are shown on this picture. And then you build up some models. So I'm going to talk in the talk about two models. One which we've developed at the University of Newcastle and includes food and exercise. And there's for those who work in this area, is there anybody here working on regulation of blood sugar levels? Is anybody doing that project? No. Okay, one of the University of Virginia, in the United States, has made available a model which you can buy, you pay for it and you get access at various levels. And this simulates a number of patients. The version I've been looking at has 10 children, 10 adolescents and 10 adults. So you'll hear me later talk about adolescent 1. He's one of the people in this, or adult 6, somebody else in the simulator. And it's meant to be realistic of how the human respond to blood sugars. So that's, and the advantage of using that, if you want to convince people about your research, is that the Federal Drug Administration in the United States have approved this model as acceptable for preclinical trials. So if you get somewhere with this simulator, then that's a first step in convincing funding bodies that you have something useful. Okay, now what are the issues? Well, the issues are that even if I take one individual with diabetes, that the model for that person changes over time. But if I take two people, the model that refers to those two people will be very different. So one thing I know for sure is that we will never get one model that fits everybody. The models for children, adolescents and adults are hugely different. But even if you take adolescents, when they go through puberty, there's a huge change in their model. Is that the older people? Who's got a teenage son or daughter going through puberty? Yeah. There are no changes really, are there? Yeah. Yeah, huge changes take place, and so also that there are emotional changes, but there are also changes in the way that the body responds to external disturbances. So I'm going to talk about two things. These are easy to understand, unlike regularisation. This is easy. I'm going to talk about calibrating models. So when a young person goes to the hospital and the doctor says, it looks as though you've got diabetes to the parents, then they do some standard tests, and from those tests we build models. So that's what I call calibration. And I'm going to use the word adaptation for tracking the model over time. So you first of all fit it, and then you know that's not going to last for too long, but you have background things that track the model. Now some of the professors here will know that a long time ago I did work on adaptive control. And I finally found a real application. Adaptive control is alive and well. Okay, so let me try then to tell you a little bit about this. Here's the calibration. Here's some thought experiments you could do. When a patient comes in, you get them into the hospital ward and you say, I want you to eat a small meal. Now, a small meal is about 30 grams of carbohydrate. Right? You give them 30 grams of carbohydrate, and then you plot their blood glucose. And then you might give them a small dose of insulin, so 1 unit of insulin, and plot their blood glucose level. And then you might put them on an exercise bike and say, we want you to do some mild exercise, which means, here I've got medium exercise, but mild might be better. Just raise your heart rate from 60 beats per minute to 90 beats per minute over a 15-minute period, and we'll watch what happens to your blood glucose level. Now this is a really interesting system because all of these responses are very different. Yep. So, food stays around for a long time. If you eat a meal, an evening meal, it's still around at midnight. if you inject, there's different types of insulin, but the standard one in use, if you inject that with the evening meal, and I'll come back to that, it disappears after 3 or 4 hours, and then, the food is gone, but now the insulin response is still there, and so you get a low. So people who work in this area, and if there's anybody here with diabetes, you will have heard about the postprandial drop in blood glucose level, which occurs typically at 3 a.m. when people are asleep. And there are many explanations, but one possible explanation is insulin still pulling down your blood glucose level, but the food has disappeared. The food response is gone. Now, what about exercise? I'm working with some endocrinologists in Australia, and they tell me that exercise has a very long-term time constant, technical word. And that if you do exercise, you can still have a response 72 hours later. So it's a very long time response to exercise. Okay, so exercise is a major thing. Now, can I come back to Danny Meads Barlow? You can look up the website, read all about it. There's a whole lot about type 1 diabetes on the website. It's called the Danny Meads Barlow Foundation. And one of the hypotheses is that the young girl went on a school excursion in the afternoon and did some mild exercise, became excited, adrenaline levels up, and then did the normal bolusing with the evening meal, but then at 3 a.m. had a drop in blood sugar level, which perhaps caused the problem. So exercise, I'm just saying that exercise is probably important. It's not known what happened to Danny. Nobody really knows, but it's one hypothesis. Right, and so this is what the sort of thing you might get. You apply a pulse of, what have I got here? Pulse of 30 grams of carbohydrate, and this is a sort of a thought picture of what the response might look like. Blood sugar goes up and then comes down. And how then do you, that's for a single pulse, but how do you get the response to a whole lot of food ingested over a long period of time? You just use convolution. Okay, and then the same thing for insulin. Insulin reduces your blood sugar level, different time constants, if you want a technical term. And these are from the UVA simulator for adult 6. This is the response due to 30 grams of carbohydrate, and this is the response due to 1 unit of insulin. So, if you were a medical practitioner and you looked at these curves, actually they don't, but they have another way of doing this. But if you looked at these curves, you'd say, well, the peak in negative insulin, the insulin reduces blood sugar, so you could say that you get sort of 20 off your blood sugar, and the 30 grams of food gives you an increase of, 75. So if you divide 75, which way do you do it? 75 by 20, you know how many units of insulin per 30 grams of carbohydrate. So this is one of the treatments called insulin to carbohydrate ratio. And so if you eat a meal, you need to estimate how much carbohydrate it is, and then you inject the corresponding amount of insulin. That's the standard treatment. Okay? This is not the way it's calculated, by the way. And so then you can build up a model. So this is the output. This is endogenous glucose production. This is the response due to food. This is the response due to exercise, which takes away blood sugar. This is the response due to insulin, which takes away blood sugar. Right? This is an interesting systems problem. There's no more relevant problem probably in the world. Okay, now for those who are more technical will know that I assume linearity in what I just wrote because I use superposition. So you can test linearity. This is a test on an adolescent, and on this curve you can see I've taken the model, fitted under the calibration conditions, and tested it under other conditions. So if you ever get to build a model, Don't ever use, it's no good collecting 1,000 samples, fitting a model, and then going back to that 1,000 samples and seeing how wonderful you fitted it, because you will always have a bias variance problem. You mustn't do that. What you have to do is fit the model under one condition and then turn to another condition and see if it's any good, right? It's called validation. Does everybody understand that? You fit the model to on one condition, you test it on another condition. Otherwise, the model is useless. It's called validation. Okay, so this is validation. What I did was to take the same model and apply insulin and carbohydrates simultaneously. And you can see it's not bad. Here I doubled the amount of insulin and doubled the amount of food and compared the two responses. Again, it's not too bad. And this table shows you that the errors for adolescents and adults is about 10%, which is remarkable. For children, not so good, about 30%. Why? Because the model for children is much more difficult, less body mass, higher sensitivity to food and insulin, all sorts of difficulties. And so I'm still working on understanding how to model children. Right, and then adaptation. What's adaptation? As I said, when I was a young boy, I worked on adaptive control. What's adaptive control mean? You monitor the system under normal operation and you try to fit the model under normal operation. Now that's a lot harder than fitting under hospital conditions. Okay, so this is a sort of thing I mean, that this is breakfast, lunch and dinner. Breakfast, lunch and dinner. This is the insulin to carbohydrate treatment, and you measure this data. You measure the blood glucose response, which looks like this. This is typical for that treatment. And you see that it goes down for this individual to about a low of about 87 or something, and a peak of about 170. This is very good regulation, actually. And then you take this data and refit the model using system identification tools, whatever that means. Least squares. Listen to the previous talk. How complex a model should you fit? Well, that's right. You see, you should have listened to the previous talk. You thought it was all nonsense. But you need to fit you can't fit a hugely complicated model. Why? Because it'll fit the data beautifully, but when you come to use it to regulate blood glucose level, it's not going to work. So you need to regularise the model. You see, it was useful, the previous talk. Okay, so we do that, and this shows you the difference over time of which one's which? Yeah, the green one is the initial model fitted in the hospital conditions, and the blue one is the one found by adaptation. You can see that it's close, but not exact. This is a little later. Everybody know the difference between calibrated and adapted models, yes? Be careful, I'm going to ask a question. You might get. Okay, so a calibrated model is one you fit under very controlled conditions, and an adapted model is you just say, go and live your life, we'll put some sensors on you, and especially a heart rate sensor and something to measure food, and come back in 2 weeks' time and we'll refit the model, maybe. Trouble with children is that they don't do what they say they do. So their parents say, you mustn't eat sweets at lunchtime. But then all their friends say, I'm going to have some sweets, and so they say, look, I'll just have one, but don't tell mum. So that's the problem with adaptive data, that it's not very reliable. Now I come to the main thing that I want to talk to everybody about. So this is, everybody should pay attention to. It's something that's close to my heart, right? And that is the issue of fundamental limits. In this area of blood glucose regulation, I don't think I saw a hand go up, but it is a hot topic around the world. Why? Because there are hundreds of billions of dollars at stake. If somebody can get a closed-loop control algorithm for this problem, they're going to retire to the Bahamas. Actually, I'm not going to retire to the Bahamas if I solve it, because I think it's not actually all that good a place. I went to a CDC conference, a conference in the Bahamas, and it wasn't all that good. I think there are nicer places in Brazil. So anyway, so there's a lot of interest in this topic, but and there's a lot of comparisons. You can read the literature, people comparing PI and PID controllers, whatever that means. Your professors all know. PI and PID. This is complete nonsense. Come on. What's the difference between a PI and a PID controller? PID and PI. The difference is one letter. It's worse than that. Everybody who... yeah, I know it's true. But everybody who works on process control knows that you always set the D to 0 anyway. So what's the difference between PI and PID control? Nothing. It's just a publicity stunt. So writing 100 papers on comparing which is best, PI and PID, is a bit silly. What about writing 300 papers on PID versus model predictive control? Equally silly, because model predictive control is another name for PID with constraints. So and you can do that in all sorts of ways, anti-wind-up and so on. So what I think is important is understanding not what can be done, nor on designing an algorithm, but working out what cannot be done. Because that tells you where you should put your effort. Wow, this is complicated. Put up your hand if you've studied this. I have. There's quite a few people who studied. Well, there's about 10 of us have studied this who are honest. Oh, more. Yeah. So, even more. Actually, a quarter of the people have studied this. I used to teach this stuff. This is telecommunications, for Telecommunications 101. Now, this is a very famous result by a person called Claude Shannon. And Claude Shannon worked out that if you've got a noisy communication channel that you want to send data over, and you're not worried about delays, right? So you want to send a picture of your holiday in Belo Horizonte to your girlfriend back home or boyfriend back home. You're not really worried if it takes 1 millisecond or 1 hour. So the delay doesn't matter, but you want to get the picture through. You don't want any mistakes in getting the picture through. So what this says is that there's a certain rate that you can send data over a noisy channel and get it to the other end with 0 errors. That's amazing. And Claude Shannon worked out what that rate was. And it's a function of the channel bandwidth and the signal at noise ratio, the energy in the signal and the energy in the noise. Now what's great is that modern phones, like this one, essentially achieve this bound by fancy coding and other techniques. So this wonderful result of Claude Shannon has been a way of saying if you go faster than this, you not only make a few errors, you make a lot of errors. But in principle, if you go at this rate, you can get the data through the other end with 0 errors. Right, so it's called the channel capacity theorem. And a modern phone essentially achieves that. Not quite, but almost. So we know that the modern phone is more or less maxed out in terms of what you can send. The only way forward is to improve the bandwidth. Right? Or to do fancy ways that you send the data, but there's not much scope left. I want to talk about phones for a minute. I'm trying to make this an interesting talk. How many mobile phones are there in the world? Does anybody know? How many mobile phones in the world?
6 billion.
That's correct. There are 6 billion mobile phones in the world. Right? So it's 1 for every person on the planet. You probably know this one too. Somebody sing out the answer, not you because you probably know it, but somebody else. What's the ratio between mobile phones and toothbrushes in the world? Do you know? Well, there are more mobile phones than toothbrushes. It's amazing, isn't it? Not only that, but the amount of data we want to send is doubling every year. doubling every year. And even I can do 2 to the 10, right? And 2 to the 10 is 1,000. So that says over the next 10 years we're going to send 1,000 times the data than we are today. And no telecommunications company, whether it be in Brazil or Australia or Sweden, can cope with this. So that's why there's a lot of research going on trying to improve the data we send. But underneath it all is Claude Shannon. Mathematics is a wonderful thing, Claude Shannon. And this tells you what you can't do. It says you can't send more data than this or you're going to make too many errors. Right, now what about blood glucose regulation? Where do the fundamental limits come from? They come from the model isn't the same. One model doesn't fit all. Not only that, but if I carefully fit a model to one individual and I come back next week, the model's not quite right. Now if I come back in 2 years, it's definitely not right. Okay, the current blood glucose sensors are not very good. We need new ones. You know? So a lot of work going in biosensors trying to improve this. They're noisy and they drift. Insulin stays in the bloodstream for a long time, so if you hit yourself with a lot of insulin and you get a great response to food, be careful, because a bit later you're going to drop your blood glucose level, especially if you do exercise. And you can't measure things. Exercise, I think, is easy. These wonderful new wristbands, they're great for exercise, but food is much more difficult, because also we need new sensors to measure the amount of carbohydrate we eat. But more than that, we'd like to know the composition of food, because what's known is that it's not just how much you eat, but what you eat it with. If you eat pasta or pizza, you get long response. If you have chips, you get a short response. If you have low glycemic index food, you get a long response. All of this you've probably heard about. And unless you use a thing called glucagon, which is which allows you to increase blood sugar level, you've got to be very careful giving yourself a lot of insulin. The traditional wisdom in control is to have high gain feedback. Now what's high gain feedback mean? Whoops, my blood sugar's up. Okay, hit it with insulin, right? Whoops, my blood sugar's down. Take some insulin. Whoops, you can't take insulin out. You can't reverse the plunger. So you've got to be very careful that you realise that there's no brake. It's like driving a Ferrari without a brake. Pretty dangerous stuff. Okay. Now the other thing is that there are delays. And this is also very interesting. You all know this problem. You're standing in the shower. And it gets too hot. Sorry, it gets too cold. You just can't turn on the hot tap like that, right? High gain feedback. It's too cold. What happens? Because you scald yourself, right? And then it gets really too hot, so then you turn the cold tap on, and now you're freezing. You've got to be very careful when you have long delays. Now, blood sugar regulation is just like the shower, excepting the delay's about 3 hours. So you've got to be very careful with high gain feedback. It doesn't really work that well. Okay, now this next bit is quite technical, so if they're undergraduates or first-year graduate students, this is a good time to have a rest. But this shows you how you can get a fundamental limitation by very simple means. And even the undergraduates and first-year postgraduates are going to get the proof. Believe me, you can follow the proof. I don't understand the proof of the channel capacity theorem of Claude Shannon. That's too hard. But you'll get this one. All right? So it's a positive system. What do I mean by a positive system? Everything's positive. You've got positive blood glucose level. You put positive insulin in. You have positive amounts of food. The impulse responses are all positive. You don't get undershoot. They're all positive. Right? So how can we exploit the fact that everything's positive? Well, because they're all positive, it means you can take things from one side of the equation across to the other side and know that it makes the other side smaller. If it's positive on this side and you take it across the other side of the equation, it becomes negative on that side and it gets less. That's the whole thing in the proof. You just take things from side to side until such time as you work out what's the very best you can do if you eat some food. Right, so you give yourself a pulse of food, what's the best you can do? Okay. And in order to do it, you need to know the responses, the positive responses to insulin and food. Now I know, hang on, insulin is negative, but it's positive when you put a negative sign in front of it. Okay, and what you can show is that there's a fundamental limitation which you can calculate just by taking things from one side of the equation to the other, because you know everything's positive, right? If they weren't all positive, if you took something from this, whoops, it might make it bigger or smaller. But because they're all positive, you can do this. Okay, and what you can show is that there's this seesaw effect. Even the medical practitioners get this one. And that is, if you try to pull down blood glucose level after you eat, afterwards you're going to get a drop in blood level. And so there's this yin-yang in blood sugar, right? Pull it down at one point, goes down even lower somewhere else. And you can work out the relationship between the two. And the proof is very simple. You just need to, as I said, take things from one side of the equation to the other. Trying to pull down the blood sugar peak, you give yourself a blood sugar trough. And you can work out the relationship between that and that. Okay, now, so you've got to be careful giving yourself too much insulin because you can get a hypoglycemic event afterwards, especially if you do exercise. Okay, now, not only that, but you can work out how you can exactly achieve that right balance. And it turns out, I'm going to ask the question in a minute, so pay attention. You can achieve this exact balance, but what you have to do is, when you eat food, take the insulin right then, not later. Because if you take the insulin a bit later, you see the response is even later. So you've got to do it straight away. Right. Yeah, but that's what people who have diabetes do. They think about the food they're going to eat and inject the insulin. There is a small change if there's somebody here who has diabetes. It's not insulin to carbohydrate ratio, but there's an offset because it's not symmetrical. You can go up more than you can go down, so it's not quite a ratio. Okay, and I can tell you the proof I've just given you that if you delay the insulin, then you get even more trough. So the best thing to do is hit it fast and hit it hard. And now this is news to the endocrinologist I'm working with because he has many papers proving that this is best. I don't know. So why does he have many papers proving this is best? Well, the thing is that the observation period is short. I think that's what the problem is. They look over a 5-hour period and they say, look, it's best to spread the insulin over a 5-hour period. But had they waited for 12 hours, they would have seen that there was a problem after a long period of time. Interesting debate with doctors, whether I'm right or they're right. Who knows? Who's on my side? Come on. Put your hand up. Who's on my side that I'm correct? That's good. Well, not so many. Come on. Everybody should be on my side.
Unless it's not linear. Unless your linear models are not good.
That's correct. That's correct. So that's one of the hypotheses that it's nonlinear. I have studied that. The main nonlinearity is well known, and if there's somebody interested in doing research in this area, the main nonlinearity is a product between blood glucose level and insulin concentration. Well, that's easily handleable, and we could redo this, and I still think it's true. But then you would say, but you still have a simplified model. Yeah, I'm with you. So, look, it's a long debate, and who knows who's right. And I'm not even claiming I'm right. I tried to make it funny by saying, who votes for me? But, okay, so I'm always right, actually. Well, I'm always right. Well, you know, I was wrong once. This is very complicated, this story. I was wrong once. Yeah, because I thought I was wrong, but I was wrong. It's very complicated.
I think it could be interesting if you can tell how a person with a functioning pancreas works.
Yes.
Is there a delay in the non-diabetic person's response?
Yeah, this is a super question, and I've been asked this before. Why don't we model healthy people and see how they regulate their blood sugar levels, look at insulin levels, see how it's responding. There are a couple of differences. One is that for treatment of a patient, the measurements and injection are under the skin, which introduces additional delays. Right, so it's not quite the same. The location of the pancreas is beautifully located with respect to major arteries, which means that the insulin goes straight into the bloodstream. But you're right, we should look at healthy people to understand better the way of the human body. In fact, there's a whole field in this. There are millions of people working on this, actually. And there's a whole thing, if you know, you might smile when I say this. There's a thing called MDF, right? What's MDF? This is Medical Doctor Fuzzy Control. MDF. We got one smile, fuzzy control. MDF is basically rules of thumb that the doctors get by looking at healthy patients. Yeah. Okay. Where am I up to? Yeah, so I think that the left one's best. Nobody can beat this gold standard unless you play tricks and say my model is not right. But if you accept my model, you can't beat this result. Why? Because it's like Claude Shannon. It's not as complicated as Claude Shannon. It's just taking positive things over to the other side of the equation. You can do it in 10 minutes. This is an undergraduate exercise, trust me. Okay, so here's the proof that on the models we have it works. Actually, this is data off the UVA simulator, so it's a little bit more realistic, but not quite. And you can see there are these troughs and highs. And what I've deliberately put the minimum at 70 milligrams of blood sugar per decilitre. Why? Because that's accepted as the usual minimum blood sugar you should have. If you go below 70, it's generally considered as approaching hypoglycemia. So that's why I put the lower limit at 70, and that sets an upper limit. That allows you, means you have to have an upper limit. But these results are very good. This is done, and again I can tell you just in passing, there are a lot of fancy tools being used here. To get these results, we use learning techniques, right? In the artificial pancreas area, this is called run-to-run, or repetitive learning. They're all the same thing. And that says that you have a day of treatment of the patient, and provided the next day is the same, you can learn from this day and say, whoops, we went a bit high, what about we do something different? And there are algorithms for doing that with constraints. So this is repetitive learning control. That's how this was obtained. You can't beat this. I know there is no better answer. Provided you accept my model. If you don't accept my model, then that's fine. Then you can beat this, or maybe you won't do as well. But there's a whole lot of research we could do. Right, almost done. Then you can all go home. Actually, I'm finishing early, but no, hang on. Don't go yet, please. You don't want to go, do you? Don't you see that? Okay. So the problem is that no day is the same, and so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. There's no break. There was a recent trial in Boston area with a whole bunch of children, adolescents, I think, who went to a camp, and they wore all this instrumentation, and that was reported as a trial of model predictive control on blood glucose regulation. And in that trial they used glucagon, which is sugar adding external device, but I don't really know. I don't know if anybody here works in this area, but it's generally believed that glucagon is not a good idea. It's not particularly stable in solution, I understand, and also it can have negative side effects. But the advantage of having it is that if you have a low, you can kick it up. It's not as trivial as it sounds. Okay, so here's the usual way of thinking about control. You make measurements, you estimate the state of the system, you then predict the future response, you choose the best input, and you apply it, and then you go around the loop again. A GPS is very common in Brazil in your car. They're expensive devices, but many people have a GPS. That's the way the GPS works. Looks at lots of satellites, makes an estimate of where you are. It then wants to know where you want to be. And it ties all sorts of routes, and it says, okay, we suggest you do this, but it's only the first turn. If you make a mistake or something happens, it doesn't matter. If it told to turn left, but you pass that intersection, you turn right, it then says recalculating the route. At the next intersection, you should turn left. So this is the basic principle of revising the strategy all the time. And it's the essence of model predictive control. You keep predicting, working out what you should do, and then revising it. Okay, so what should you measure? This is one of the big things I want to say. We should measure everything under the sun, because the current blood glucose measurements are noisy, drift, and so we need multiple measurements. We also want to measure exercise levels. We need to wear wristbands. We need to get input on food, and even adrenaline. Again, for those who are interested, this is an interesting story. There was a group of elite athletes who recently did the Sydney to Surf run. I think it's about 15 kilometres in Sydney. They all had type 1 diabetes. And they were all instrumented up to see what the impact of intense exercise was, because they had to run 15 kilometres. But moral of the story is they're all standing on the start line, ready to go, and all of their blood sugar levels were through the roof. Anticipation. You know, so this is a tough problem. So they went through the roof. Now, you don't want to correct with insulin right now, because the person's... Why are they excited? Because they're about to do a 15-kilometre run. If you hit them with a lot of insulin, you're going to kill the person. So it's a tricky problem. So, but the traditional thing is you work out where you are, you measure the state. That's easy. Kalman filtering. A lot of the people in the audience knew of Rudy Kalman. Then you need to predict the future response. Now, here is a problem, because the future is not what it used to be. That's meant to be a joke, but the future is hard to predict. If every day was the same, remember the picture I showed? The boy's name's Jack, by the way. And if Jack did the same thing every day, we would know at 7 a.m. what he's going to do. He's going to have 119 grams of carbohydrate breakfast, which he does. You would know that he's going to have a 60-gram carbohydrate lunch, which he doesn't. Right? He has a very variable lunch. And we would know at breakfast time that at dinner he's going to have another 60 grams. But he doesn't. He has 15 to 90 grams of carbohydrate for dinner. So prediction is difficult. I haven't mentioned exercise, but I'll show you Mondays for Jack in a moment. And some days they have school exercise and some days they don't, because there's rain or there's another school excursion, or the teacher decides that they're going to go to the library today, the municipal library. So no day is the same. There's high variability. So prediction, which is the essence of model predictive control, is difficult. But disturbances in this problem, I think, are really crucial. I don't think you can just respond to the measured blood glucose level. Right, so we're actually going to use stochastic dynamic programming, whatever that is. That's only for those who followed the first part of the lecture. It's some very fancy tool. We actually don't just look at one route from here to Sao Paulo, but we look at 100,000 routes from here to Sao Paulo. And this is for GPS. And then we make conditional decisions. So we make a decision now on the understanding, what's the city between here and Sao Paulo? Somebody sing one out for me. That when we reach, come on, give me a name. A city between here and Sao Paulo. When we reach, yeah, we can revise our strategy, because at that time we'll know how the traffic conditions have changed. So our current decision is predicated on the ability to change the decision down the track. And this is the essence of dynamic programming. Good grief. So I'm developing two models for people. I'm developing a blood glucose response model, which says if you give me how much food you're going to eat over the next 24 hours, and you tell me what exercise you're going to do, I can predict your blood glucose level for a given level of insulin. But I'm also building what I call lifestyle models, which says that on Mondays, you normally do a certain thing. On Mondays, you play squash on Monday nights, usually. Right. Now I'm going to give you the... and then you solve a constrained optimization problem over 100,000 insulin regimes, and you apply the first one, and it's all great stuff, maybe. Let me give you an example. I want to give this squash example. Say you've got a 50% chance of playing squash. Who plays squash? Anybody play squash? Not very common in... It's not very common in Brazil. It's boring. Squash. I was going to tell you a story. I was fortunate to get some of this patented just to protect because there's so many people working on it. And we got help from the university, and the academics might want to ask me, what's the patenting rules in Australia for university academics? Anyway, the patent attorney is a lawyer, right? Is anybody related to a lawyer? Okay, I'm not going to tell lawyer Jackson. Okay, so he's a lawyer, so you wouldn't expect him to know anything about what I'm doing. But he also has an engineering degree, so he actually knew what I was doing. But I told him the squash story, and he said, I like your squash example. And I said, why are you so interested in my squash example? He said, well, when I was a little bit younger, I was the Australian junior squash champion, which means that this guy is a very good squash player. He's a very good squash player. So he knew the story. So here we go. We've got a 50% chance of playing squash. Now, if you ignore future disturbances, when you eat your evening meal, you'd inject 5 units of insulin. All good. Then you come and you play the squash, and your blood glucose drops, and that's bad. Better wake up and eat some sugar. Then there's, well, why don't we take it's 50% chance of playing squash. Why don't we assume that it's a 50% game of squash and we do 2.5 units of insulin? But mostly we play squash. Why squash? Squash is pretty intense exercise, if anybody has ever played it. And so now you've still done it wrong. So what does dynamic programming do? This is hedging your bets. What you do, it's on the next slide. Let me go to the bottom. What you do is you do 1 unit of insulin with your evening meal. When you get to 9 p.m, you will now know whether you've played squash or not. If you have played squash, all finished, you're done, because the exercise will do the rest for blood sugar. If you didn't do squash, now you give yourself the rest of the 4 units. Right? Makes sense. That's dynamic programming 101. All right, I'm going to finish with some results. This is actually Mondays for Jack, and you can see that, yes, breakfasts are very well controlled, but the other meals are not so, and dinner's all over the place. This is a typical exercise pattern. You can see that some days he does exercise and some days he doesn't. There are probabilities associated with this, all of which can be taken account of. Okay, so if you just do constant insulin flow, then you're going to get a high in blood glucose because you're not taking any account. Nobody does this. This gives you a high in blood sugar, as you can see. Goes up to 350, not very good. Does this very often happen? Absolutely, because the treatment is difficult. So if there is a sufferer here, they can tell you afterwards that, 300 can happen. Then you ring the doctor, I guess, and say, what do I do? This is with the standard bolusing. And what do I mean by bolusing? That's just an injection. And this is based on insulin to carbohydrate ratio. Why this isn't so good is there's no account of exercise whatsoever. And in truth, exercise is accounted for, right? But in a somewhat ad hoc way. So if you're going to play exercise, a bit less. This is model predictive control. Model predictive control has difficulty knowing what's coming, and so here we assume nothing is coming. Right? And so this is not quite so good either. If there are people working in this area and you think you could do better with model predictive control, I agree with you. This is just my humble attempt. And this is where we're up to. It's really exciting results. You can see this trade-off between the peak and the trough, which I talked about before. You can't avoid this because this is due to the fact it's a positive system. We set a lower limit. No matter what you eat or what exercise you do, you should have an insulin injection program, which means you never go below 70. That's how this was done. And then you pay the consequence that some days you go up to 170. But there's nothing you can do about that. Does that make sense? Now this looks really good and I'm excited by these results. These are not results on real patients. So if anybody's got about $2 million US dollars to give me, then please hand it over, because that's the sort of level of funding I need. Not for me. Wouldn't that be nice if it was for me? But this is what it costs to do patient trials. To do patient trials, they've got to be properly supervised with doctors and nurses present and so on, so that you protect the patient's interest at all costs. So I need a lot of money, so I'm applying for lots of money. What's the conclusions to this little part of my talk? Diabetes is a major health issue. I've given this talk to you because I think it's interesting and it shows that systems and control can be really important for real-world problems, not just flying aircraft or driving cars, but or compact displays, but also for life problems, and this is a life problem. There are 500 million roughly sufferers in the world, so a lot of people are interested in this research, much more than energy-efficient cars. Who cares? We don't believe in greenhouse gas emissions in Australia anyway. We do. Current treatments are often good, but can be poor. I think advanced control and systems understanding can be helpful because we understand dynamics and delays, and gains and all that sort of stuff. And I think we need to go between model predictive control, and I've suggested this very complicated strategy. Now, to do this kind of research, you don't do this by yourself. This is not theoretical research. It needs a team. And so I'm working with people throughout Australia. And, we remember the name game we played before, Where Was I Born? I'm working with doctors in Newcastle, Perth, Melbourne and Sydney. I'm trying to get funding from the United States, from Australia, from the Danny Moods Barlow Foundation, so on. And this is just a small picture of some of the team, some of the doctors and some of the engineering team in Newcastle. There's a few more people in this involved. The principal person in terms of the medical calibration is this guy. His name is Bruce King, and he's the paediatric endocrinologist at the John Hunter Hospital in Newcastle. Okay, so this was meant to be interesting. Did you find it interesting? Yes. Come on. Thank you. Is this more interesting than regularization? Don't answer that. Come on. Now, this was an injection of things that I hadn't planned to talk about. But when you're all the way over there in Australia, which is a long way away, it's in the same hemisphere at least, you can't picture what the audience is going to be like. And I'll tell you the truth. I should have asked. But I had this picture of about 20 PhD students who are studying advanced control, sitting in a room, listening to me talk about really important new tools, you see. And so that's what I planned. I spent a long time writing these slides on rank-constrained optimization. But then when I saw the audience and when I started asking questions, I realised that this would be a heck of a lot more interesting. And the truth is, I find this more interesting, to be honest. But one of the messages I want to give to everybody is that, you know, you don't do this without the background in systems and control. The little result on the positive systems I think is important It may not be the answer to the world's problems, and the Dr. Bruce King, where is he? Yes, hello, Bruce. Disagrees with the conclusions, right? But I think it opens the door to a very valuable debate about what is the cause, what's going on. And without some background in systems and control, you don't start taking things from the left-hand side of equations to the right-hand side of equations. So message is, do the system science, because even when you come to a really practical thing, it becomes really, really important. And I made it sound easy, but I want to tell you that maybe it's me, but actually that result on the positive systems, taking things from the left-hand side of the equation to the right-hand side of the equation, actually took me about 6 months. Because I sort of guessed that it should work, but I didn't know which things to take from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, or which things to forget. And after 3 months, I thought I had it, and then one of my students, actually this boy, this is a lovely, lovely man called Diego Carrasco. He comes from Chile, and Diego read it and said, whoops, on about line 20, Graham, you took something from one side to the other and you changed its sign, so it's not correct. And so I worked then with Diego to fix it up. Let me see if I can tell you who these people are. This lady here is a dietitian. This lady's a medical doctor doing a PhD in medicine, and she's really interested in this project because her son suffers from type 1 diabetes. Where are we? This lady back. This person here is another doctor, and she doesn't have children, but she's interested in this project. This lady here is an engineer, so she's on the engineering side, but is very interested in this project because her son's name is Jack. All right? So that completes the story. Now I think if you didn't, I'm about to finish, so don't worry, don't panic. But if you found this interesting, I appreciate that. But if you didn't find the first bit of value, I think this would be a good time to go. If you want to stay, what I'm going to do is talk about rank-constrained optimization. And if you found this morning tough, it's now going to get 10 times tougher. So I'll pause, and I expect 90% of the audience to go. Don't be embarrassed. If I was sitting there, I would go. But those who really want a new tool, because the new tool, I think, is really great for the system researchers, because in optimization, we're finding ways of solving very hard problems. And these cardinality constrained problems, 1,000 variables, I know 3 are important, but which 3 I'm not sure. There are now convex ways of sort of treating those problems, which I'll talk about. So I'm now going to finish, turn my back. I expect 90% of the audience to go, maybe 100%, in which case I can relax. So once again, thank you for listening. Oh, and if you've got any questions, ask. It's a good time to ask. Who's got a question? Yeah. Want to do questions?
I'll ask the question before somebody might read.
Yeah.
It has to do with this part.
Yeah.
From time to time you hear about these people advocating in favor of model-based control
Yep.
against something which is not so model-based control. But in the end, they use models which are coded in a different way.
Way, yes.
So where would you fit your procedure, and how critical is the model for the quality of the control that you get in the end?
Yeah.
Can I ask the same question in different phrase?
Sure, sure.
You're doing some sort of adaptive control, right?
As well as many other things.
Is it direct or indirect?
Oh my goodness. That's a very technical question.
Right, but it's the same question.
Okay, so the questions were that some people approach control problems, and especially this control problem, with more heuristic-based control. And the fuzzy control is one of those techniques. We have rule-based control. Now the truth is that the way that medical practitioners deal with all human conditions is by a form of fuzzy control, rule-based control. It's quite qualitative, but is based on very well-founded and understandings which come from years of observing patients, right? So this person here, well, God, I've lost him. I don't know how to get him back. But Bruce King has spent 20 years studying pediatrics, children, and their response to drugs and for diabetes, not that sort of drug. That's a different problem. And so he has a huge library in his head of rules. But I think an interesting thing is to combine that with the models that we're more used to, which is x dot equals ax plus bu. And I think that the real answer lies somewhere between, right? So in these lifestyle models, they're not x dot equals ax plus bu, but they're more models which describe in language what people normally do. So they're a combination of the two, and I think the combination is right. Now, you asked me about adaptive control. It's indirect adaptive control. What the difference is whether you, in direct adaptive control, you directly estimate the coefficients, am I right? It's a long time since I worked on this, but you directly estimate the coefficients that drive your controller. All right? Now, in some sense, run-to-run is of that nature, because in run-to-run, what you do is you're directly changing the control strategy by observing yesterday. So in a sense, that's a form of direct adaptive control. But what I think is we will use indirect adaptive control. Now, what does indirect adaptive control mean? If I remember, it's many years. But you fit a model and then you take that model and you use that model to design a control system where the coefficients in the model don't immediately appear. Now, why is that true? Because of constraints and all sorts of issues that we can put into the control system design but wouldn't directly map from the estimator. And so the control system design is more complicated than we would directly estimate. But the run-to-run is direct adaptive control in the sense that you adapt the control strategy directly, day to day. The problem with run-to-run, and there's a lot of papers on run-to-run in this area, the problem is that no Monday's the same. That people do different things. Again, talking about Jack, on Saturdays is a big problem because at 11 o'clock, usually Saturdays he's meant to do his homework, but on Saturdays his mates can come around at 11 o'clock and say, let's go and kick a football, let's do some soccer. And his mum never says no, because to do so would ruin his life. So go and play soccer, we'll sort out the treatment later. Yeah? So, yeah, it's complicated business. Anybody else want to ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's all about for the reference. It is included in the control law. This limit is valid for all patients.
The 70 lower limit.
Yes.
Now again, that's an interesting debate as to whether that lower limit, 70 milligrams per decilitre is normally accepted as a good lower limit, but some people can tolerate less and so on. I should also say about these limits that the lower limit is much more devastating than the upper limit. So if you were designing a cost function, you would normally make it look like this, or like this, where you would not worry so much about deviations on the low side, but you'd be on the high side, but you would be worried about deviations on the on the low side. And one thing I definitely believe in, right, is, and this is a very interesting thing, is individualised treatment policies. I think that's what you're getting at a little bit. And that is the models have to be fitted to an individual, they have to be adapted to the individual, and your control strategy needs to take account of the individual's lifestyle and work habits and exercise habits, how excited they get when they're going to do a marathon. Who in the audience runs marathons? This time I'm not putting my hand up. Anybody here run marathons? Yeah, you do. No, you just waved your hand. But yeah, I don't. But if you run marathons, you know that you would need to be careful with if you had diabetes on the impact. Yeah. So individual medicine, that's the way of the future. E-medicine targeted at an individual. Their genetic composition, sensors for that individual. Maybe one person needs to have adrenaline measurements, and that their sweat is a very good way of measuring.
Estimate the flower bone.
What? Say again.
They used to estimate the flower bone by measuring all the physiological.
That's right. All the physiological, but they might differ from individuals. Sorry, feedback. From individual to individual. Other questions? Other questions? Yep. Yes, are you saying that people whose resistance to insulin changes? I wasn't so. That people change.
Yes, but there is a phenomenon that people become resistant.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's one of the major things, that people's sensitivity to insulin changes with time. Is that what you're getting at? And it changes from individual to individual. And so that's why I think you need to have some form of adaptive control, where you track those changes. But they're major issues, and there's a lot of research which you may know about on actually measuring as a parameter sensitivity to insulin. That's a whole research field in its own right. And there are patents on how you measure insulin sensitivity, because it's known to change. But your response to food changes. There's a whole. This is a non-trivial control problem, but a really important one. Okay. Any other questions? Come on. Must be one more. Yes. Come on.
About the system that you
Sorry. Just start again.
about the system that you put on the patients.
Yes.
How long can they stay before they have to change?
Yeah.
That was an issue
Yeah.
years before.
Yeah. Okay, so how long can you wear the instrumentation, and the pump is the question, and the answer is not all that long, maybe for a month or so, but then it needs to be looked at by a medical practitioner, so this is all non-trivial. That's why we need new non-invasive sensors. If you could measure blood sugar level by looking at your sweat, this you could wear forever. Not the injection of insulin, however. So these are important issues, very important issues. I just was involved in a small trial, and the sensor worked perfectly for 1 week and then failed. So that gives you an idea. But it's not easy. Any other questions? Who wants to ask a question on rank constrained? No. All right, so I'm now going to say that's the end, and I really enjoyed my visit here. But if you want to hear just 10 minutes on rank-constrained optimisation, stay. Right, so I turn my back, go home, go on. Come on, off you go. Must be somebody who doesn't want to hear rank-constrained optimisation.
I will distract you for a minute. Can I distract you for a minute so
Sure.
you don't see them?
Yeah,
I was thinking of asking you a favor.
yeah,
And you can totally say no, but
Sure.
maybe you can get me out of a pickle.
yeah,
I have a very bright undergraduate student who
Yeah.
has some money to spend maybe 3 months
Yeah.
abroad.
yes.
And we sort of had a plan to go to the